Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at a topic that is as complex as it is critical: the lasting impact of childhood trauma.
Yeah, it's definitely a heavy one, but
Yeah.
but an important one for sure. And whether you've experienced it yourself or, someone who has, I think we're all going to learn a lot from this deep dive because the source material is really unique.
Absolutely. So we're working with an article from StuGeek.new. Have you heard of this platform?
Yeah, I've come across it before. It's known for, diving deep into those tough social issues that a lot of folks shy away from. So I'm curious to see what they have to say.
Yeah, me too. And what makes this even more interesting is that this particular article was co-created with AI.
Oh, wow. So it's like a blend of human insight and artificial intelligence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a human contributor named Mike working alongside an AI partner. And they've also woven in research from, experts and studies, all kinds of things. So it's a very comprehensive look at this very difficult topic.
That's fascinating. I think that's where things are heading more and more. This collaboration between humans and AI to really delve into complex topics.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So before we get into the heavy stuff, I think we need to start with a definition. What exactly is childhood trauma?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about, a single event, right?
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
Trauma, it's more about the emotional, psychological, even physiological responses that happen because of an event or a series of events. It's like this ripple effect that can last long after the actual event itself is over.
I like that analogy, the ripple effect.
Yeah.
Because, I think a lot of times people think of trauma as, maybe like a car accident or some kind of, singular event.
Right.
But it's much more than that.
Much more. And it's those responses that really define what trauma is. So, you mentioned the car accident, but it could also be things like, abuse, neglect, violence. Those are probably more what people expect when they think of trauma.
Yeah, the more obvious things.
Right. But then there's also what we might think of as quote unquote common experiences that can be really deeply traumatic for a child, especially.
So you're talking about things like bullying
Mm-hmm.
or even growing up with a parent who's, struggling with addiction or mental illness.
Exactly. Those situations, they create this chronic stress.
Mm.
And that chronic stress, it can be just as damaging to a developing child as a single traumatic incident.
It's like living with this low-level threat that just never really goes away.
Precisely. And to understand how that really works, we need to look at the science. The article spends a lot of time exploring, how childhood trauma actually shapes the developing brain.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting to me. They talk about the amygdala, which is like that fear center of our brain, basically going into overdrive.
It's almost like it's constantly on high alert, like it's scanning for danger even when the person's perfectly safe.
And that's not a conscious choice, right?
Not at all. For someone who's experienced trauma, their amygdala is just wired that way. It's based on their past experiences. It's trying to protect them, but in a way that can be really debilitating.
That actually makes me think about, I used to jump like a mile anytime someone slammed a door. I mean, it was like this involuntary reaction.
Right.
I didn't even realize I was doing it, but looking back, I realized I was just always kind of braced for something bad to happen.
That's a perfect example of a sensitized amygdala in action.
Wow. Yeah.
It's your brain trying to protect you based on what it's learned in the past. But the downside is it makes it really hard to relax and feel safe in the present moment.
So it's not just about being, startled easily.
Yeah.
It's about this underlying sense of unease.
Exactly. And it's not just the amygdala that's affected. And the article also talks about the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of our brain responsible for like executive function planning, decision making.
So kind of like the CEO of the brain.
Exactly.
Keeping everything running smoothly.
Exactly. But when trauma hits during childhood, it's like that CEO is constantly under fire. It's hard to think clearly. It's hard to regulate those big emotions.
So it's not that someone is choosing to be reactive or impulsive. Their brain literally hasn't had the chance to develop the tools to manage those impulses.
Right. It's like they're working with a limited toolkit.
And then to make things even more complex, we've got the hippocampus, which is involved in memory and, distinguishing between past and present.
Right. And trauma can really disrupt the development of the hippocampus as well.
So meaning it becomes difficult to separate what happened in the past from what's happening right now.
Exactly. It can lead to flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, all those things that can be incredibly distressing.
It's like you're constantly reliving the trauma even though it's over.
That's a really good way to put it. And this is why understanding the science behind trauma is so important. It helps us move away from, judgment and blame.
And toward compassion.
Exactly. And the research really backs this up. There's a ton of research from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and their studies show that these brain changes, they can really contribute to, lifelong mental health challenges.
Like PTSD, anxiety, depression.
All of those things.
Wow. So we're not just talking about emotional scars. There are actual measurable changes happening in the brain.
That's right. And that leads us to a really important question. How does this all show up in adulthood? Often in ways that we don't even realize.
Because it's not like there's this flashing neon sign, that says, hey, I have childhood trauma.
Right. Trauma can be really sneaky in the way it manifests.
So how does it show up? What are some of the signs?
Well, the article outlines a few key areas where childhood trauma can manifest in adulthood. Things like emotional dysregulation, attachment issues, struggles with self-worth, physical health problems, and even destructive behaviors.
Okay, so we need to unpack each of those, I think.
Yeah.
Let's start with emotional dysregulation because I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to. What does that actually look like in everyday life?
Well, it could be anything from, extreme mood swings to anger that just seems to come out of nowhere. Like, let's say you're at work and someone gives you some constructive criticism and you just completely overreact. You find yourself snapping at them or getting defensive in a way that's totally out of proportion to the situation.
So it's not just about feeling emotions intensely. It's about those emotions feeling out of control.
Exactly. It's like that emotional volume knob is just stuck on high.
And you haven't learned how to turn it down.
Right. And this often ties into the next area, which is attachment issues.
Now, I've heard of attachment issues, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, so attachment, it's basically how we bond with other people and form relationships. But what's interesting is that trauma can lead to two different but equally challenging attachment patterns. Avoidant attachment and anxious attachment.
So it's not just about having trouble connecting. It's about connecting in ways that might be unhealthy or even painful.
Right. Avoidant attachment might look like pushing people away before they can hurt you, even if deep down you really crave closeness.
Right. It's that fear of getting too close.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, anxious attachment. It can make you cling to relationships. You're terrified of being abandoned, even if it's not a healthy relationship.
And that's often rooted in, the fear that those early caregivers weren't consistently there for you.
Precisely. So it's like your nervous system is stuck in that fight or flight mode, even in relationships.
So where does self-worth fit into all of this?
Well, imagine growing up in an environment where you're constantly criticized or told you're not good enough. Over time, those messages, they get internalized, and you start to believe them.
So those negative messages, they become beliefs about yourself.
Exactly. It can lead to chronic low self-esteem, crippling shame, or this constant drive to be perfect as a way of trying to prove your worth.
It's like you're always trying to earn love and approval, even from yourself.
And that takes a huge toll on your mental and emotional well-being, which then spills over into physical health problems.
Right, the mind-body connection. The article talks about how the chronic stress of living with unhealed trauma it can actually impact the body in some pretty serious ways.
Oh, absolutely. Your body, it's designed to handle short bursts of stress. But when that stress becomes chronic, like it often does with unresolved trauma, it can wreak havoc on your systems.
They mention things like heart disease, autoimmune disorders, even digestive problems. Like the trauma is literally etched into your cells.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And it's often through these physical symptoms that people first realize that, something deeper is going on.
So we've got the emotional, the mental, the physical impacts. But the article also talks about destructive behaviors. And I think this is where things can get really tricky because it's so easy to judge those behaviors without understanding the underlying cause.
Absolutely. We have to remember that things like substance abuse, self-sabotage, even reckless risk-taking, they're often attempts to cope with unhealed pain.
So it's not just about making bad choices. It's about those behaviors serving a purpose.
Exactly. It might be a way to numb the pain or distract from difficult emotions, or even subconsciously recreate those familiar patterns of chaos.
It's like the brain is saying, I know this hurts, but at least it's familiar.
Right. But that doesn't mean that those behaviors are healthy or that someone's stuck with them forever.
And that brings us to a really important message that the article emphasizes, and I think it's worth repeating. It's not your fault.
It's so important to remember that.
You didn't choose the circumstances that you were in, and you were just doing your best to survive in a world that felt really unsafe.
Absolutely. And holding on to that shame and guilt only makes the healing process that much harder. It's like carrying around this heavy weight that prevents you from moving forward.
So how do we start to put that weight down? I know the article shifts gears to talk about the healing process. And I have to admit, after all that heavy stuff about the impacts of trauma, It's kind of a relief to start talking about solutions.
Yeah, I think we could all use a little bit of hope right now, right? So what does healing actually look like? What are some of the steps we can take to start reclaiming our lives after trauma?
Yeah, it really is about, shifting that perspective from blame and shame to understanding and self-compassion.
So where do we even begin? Like, how do we start to put that weight down? The article talks about the healing process, but, for a lot of people, that can feel kind of abstract or even overwhelming.
It can be.
Hmm.
And, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to healing, but the article does outline some really practical steps that can help people start that journey.
Okay, I'm all ears. Because I know for a lot of folks, the idea of healing can feel, kind of out of reach.
Right. It's not about erasing the past. It's about learning to live with it in a way that doesn't define you.
So what's step one?
Well, the first step, and this is often a cornerstone of the healing process, is therapy.
Okay. Yeah, therapy. I think there's still, kind of a stigma around therapy, but honestly, it's like if you broke your leg, you'd go to a doctor, right?
Yeah. It's the same thing with mental and emotional health. Sometimes we need a little extra support to guide us through the healing process.
And there are so many different approaches to therapy out there. The article mentions cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT,
Right, CBT.
which helps you identify and change those negative thought patterns, those unhelpful beliefs that we were talking about earlier.
So it's not just about talking about your feelings. It's about actually rewiring your brain to think and respond differently.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's trauma-focused therapy, which specifically addresses the trauma and its effects.
I imagine that could be really intense, but also incredibly powerful.
It can be. And then there's EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is gaining a lot of recognition for its effectiveness in helping people process traumatic memories.
Okay, I've heard of EMDR, but honestly, it always sounded kind of strange to me. Can you explain a little bit more about how that works?
Sure. So EMDR, it's based on this idea that when a traumatic event happens, that memory can get kind of stuck in the brain's processing system. And so EMDR uses bilateral stimulation like eye movements or tapping to help reprocess that memory and reduce its emotional intensity.
So it's not about forgetting the memory. It's about changing how your brain reacts to it.
Exactly. It's about taking away the power that that trauma has over you.
I like that. Taking back your power.
Yeah. And alongside therapy, the article also highlights the importance of practices like mindfulness and meditation.
Okay, yeah, I've dabbled in those a little bit, and I could definitely see how they'd be helpful for someone who's, always on edge or feels kind of disconnected from their body.
Right, because mindfulness, it's all about being present in the moment without judgment.
Right, just noticing what's happening.
Exactly. It's like training your brain to focus on what's happening right now rather than getting caught up in the past or worrying about the future.
So it was a way to kind of calm that overactive nervous system and find a sense of grounding.
Exactly. And then meditation, it takes it a step further by teaching you to observe your thoughts and emotions without getting swept away by them.
It's like those thoughts are clouds passing by.
Yeah.
You can notice them, but you don't have to grab onto each one.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And along with mindfulness and meditation, the article also recommends journaling.
Oh, journaling's a big one for me.
Yeah.
I've always found it to be a really safe space to process my emotions and kind of get things out of my head.
It is, and it can be especially powerful for trauma survivors who might not feel ready to talk about their experiences out loud. Writing it down can be a way to start making sense of those feelings and experiences.
And I think sometimes just the act of putting words to those feelings can make them feel less overwhelming.
Absolutely. It's like you're externalizing them.
Getting them out of your body.
Exactly. And then as you start to heal and you start to feel safer in your own skin, building healthy relationships becomes really essential.
Yeah, because trauma can really mess with your ability to trust, right? I imagine it can make intimacy really scary.
It can. But surrounding yourself with people who are empathetic, supportive, trustworthy, that can help to rewrite those old patterns of distrust and fear.
So it's about finding your tribe, those people who feel safe and who get it.
Exactly. And finally, the article really emphasizes the importance of self-compassion.
This one's so hard for so many people, especially those who've experienced trauma.
Yeah.
It's like they've internalized all that criticism and judgment and they turn it inwards.
Right. That inner critic can be brutal. But learning to treat yourself with kindness and understanding, especially during those setbacks, is vital for healing.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that you're doing the best you can with what you've been through.
Exactly. And honestly, that's a message that everyone needs to hear.
Right, not just trauma survivors.
Exactly. But the article doesn't just stop at individual healing. It also highlights the role of society in addressing childhood trauma.
Okay, yeah, because it's not just an individual problem, right?
Yeah.
It's a systemic issue that needs broader solutions.
Precisely. They talk about the need for education and awareness in schools and communities. If teachers, caregivers, other adults can recognize the signs of trauma and respond in supportive ways, that can make a huge
Yeah,
difference.
it's about creating trauma-informed environments where
Mhm.
kids feel safe and understood. And honestly, that goes for workplaces too.
Absolutely.
Like imagine a world where bosses were trained to recognize, signs of trauma in their employees
Mm,
and offer support.
that would be amazing.
Yeah.
And of course, access to mental health care is crucial. We need to break down those barriers of cost and availability so that everyone who needs help can get it.
Especially for early intervention,
Yeah.
right? The sooner a child gets support, the better their chances of healing and avoiding those long-term consequences that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. And finally, they talk about the importance of breaking cycles of abuse.
Yeah, because so often, those who've experienced trauma end up perpetuating it. Not out of, malice, but because it's the only model of relating that they know.
Right. It's what they've learned.
So it's about, creating programs that help parents heal from their own trauma so they can create a safe and nurturing environment for their kids.
Exactly. It's about stopping that generational transmission of pain.
I love that. It's like planting a seed of healing that can ripple outwards for generations to come.
Beautiful imagery.
So we've talked a lot about, the individual healing process. But you mentioned that the article also brings in some perspectives from, some big names in the field of trauma.
It does. It mentions Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that book.
He's done some groundbreaking work on how trauma is stored in the body, not just the mind.
Which makes sense,
Yeah.
given all those physical health problems we were discussing earlier.
Mhm.
It's not just about talking about the trauma, it's about addressing those physical sensations, too.
And they also quote Dr. Gabor Mate, who has done some incredible work on the link between childhood trauma and addiction.
Oh, Dr. Mate.
Yeah.
He's one of my favorites. He has such a compassionate way of talking about addiction.
Yeah.
Not as a moral failing, but as a response to unhealed pain.
Exactly. He argues that so many destructive behaviors are actually attempts to self-medicate,
To find relief.
to find relief from that unbearable weight of the past.
And I think that's such an important message.
Mhm.
We can't address addiction or any other destructive behavior without acknowledging that root cause.
I completely agree. And finally, they share the story of Oprah Winfrey,
Enter.
who's been very open about her own experiences with trauma and how therapy helped her heal and transform her life.
I love that she uses her platform to destigmatize therapy and talk about mental health.
It's so inspiring.
It really is. So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway message for our listener?
Yeah, it's a powerful story, and it shows that, healing, it's possible for everyone.
Yeah, no matter what you've been through or where you are in life, there's always hope.
Exactly.
Mm.
And it's a journey. It takes time. It takes work, but it's so worth it.
It's so worth it. And before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about those, those big names in the field of trauma.
Mm.
We talked about Oprah, but there were a couple others, right?
Yeah, they also highlighted Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He wrote The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
And he emphasizes that, trauma, it's not just a psychological experience. It gets embedded in our physical being.
It's like they say, the issues are in the tissues.
Exactly. And Dr. van der Kolk talks about how traditional talk therapy isn't always enough. Healing from trauma often involves addressing those physical sensations, finding ways to release that trapped energy.
So things like yoga or dance or even massage could be part of the healing process.
Absolutely. Anything that helps you reconnect with your body and regulate your nervous system can be incredibly beneficial.
Makes sense. And then there's Gabor Mate, who we mentioned earlier. He's done some amazing work on the link between childhood trauma and addiction.
He's brilliant. He has such a compassionate way of framing addiction.
He really does.
Not as a moral failing, but as a response to unhealed pain.
Exactly. He argues that, so many destructive behaviors are actually attempts to cope with that pain, to self-medicate in a way.
And that's such a crucial message.
It really is. We can't address addiction or any other self-destructive behavior without acknowledging that root cause.
It's like trying to put out a fire by only dealing with the smoke. You have to go to the source of the flames.
I love that analogy. So for our listener, who's been with us on this deep dive, what's the one thing we want them to walk away with today?
I think the core message is this. Childhood trauma is not a life sentence. It can have a profound impact, but healing is possible.
And choosing to heal is an act of courage. An act of self-love.
And it's a journey that might take time, but every step you take towards wholeness is a victory.
Every step is a victory. I love that. It's a reminder to be patient with yourself and celebrate those small wins along the way.
And remember, you're not alone in this. There are resources available. There are people who understand. And there's a whole community of survivors who are walking this path alongside you.
That's such a powerful reminder. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been an incredibly insightful conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration. We hope this deep dive is giving you a better understanding of childhood trauma, its impacts, and most importantly, the possibility of healing. Remember, you are strong, you are resilient, and you are capable of amazing things.